Hello and welcome to another late night talk. My guest this evening is Gabriela Houston. Welcome. Hi.
Hello.
Hello. Say hello. You're on camera, remember? It's not a podcast. Tonight we're going to be talking about her new book, The Bone Roots. But for those who don't know anything about you, there's the book. There it is. Tell the viewers a little bit about your sort of background, your origin story. What kind of stuff are you reading growing up and your influences and stuff like that?
So I'm Gabriela Houston. I'm a Polish author living in UK, and I'm the author of four Slavic folklore-inspired novels, two for children and two for adults. So The Bone Roots is my second adult story inspired by Slavic mythology and Slavic folklore. Mm-hmm. So in terms of the books that I read growing up, in Poland, like the folkloric sort of traditions were not particularly popular when I was growing up. So I had like the fairy tales and the storybooks when I was very little. And, on school trips, you would get the legends of the castle, of the legends of this, of this town or whatever. But I kind of moved on, after the first sort of picture books based in Slavic mythology, I started reading a lot from other world mythologies. And I only came back to Slavic folklore as an adult. And I'm actually really glad that I had this period in between when I read stories from other cultures, because it brought like a different level of understanding to it, and it allowed me to compare them in different ways. So the thing that's really important to me when I'm kind of looking at folklore and like taking inspiration from it for my writing is like looking at the it's hard to describe. It's kind of like the right authentic feel of the stories in terms of the values that they represent, of how the community operated, right. Because even if you're not using the story in a literal sense, like this is, you rewrite the story. What I want to preserve is that sense of values and how I interpret like ancient Slavs seeing the world, like in terms of how they interacted with the spirit world, how they conducted their everyday business, according to what rules. So all of that is brought into the story, because a lot of my writing in The Bone Roots, especially because it's about two mothers who are trying to protect their children, and the things that I really look at are not just like the family relationships and the wider community relationships, and how the different pressures sort of work together, like in terms of like, where does your duty lie, where does your responsibility lie, things like that.
So I started, grew up in the UK, so I read a lot of the Greek and Roman mythology books as a kid. But once I'd gone through all of them, I then, like you, I started reading across everything that they had in the library, all the other mythology books, because that's all I was reading for a while. And I found, so I don't know about you, but did you find many parallels between stories in other countries across the world? Because I have found some that kind of resonate, and I'll say to someone, oh, do you know about the story of so-and-so? And they're like, that sounds familiar. And it's not the same, but there's connective tissue between countries.
Yes. I think, people like to think of their cultures as being very separate, but when you look at the historical maps of how communities moved around, and like the one constant in human history was migration.
Yes.
So that's why it's so funny to me when I hear politicians, being so dead set against people like migrants, the migrants. It's like migration is an intrinsic part of human history and intrinsic part of human nature. And, so when you look at the lands that make up Poland now, like all the tribes that made that up is just, you can't distinguish like between one and the other, like we can tell like these tribes tended to mix more than others, but there's, like also Slavic languages belong to the Indo-European family of languages.
Yeah.
So, you have that link. And sometimes you hear words like some words in Polish sound very similar to words in Sanskrit.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a weird thing for me to discover. Like, like the word for 5 is like pięć in Polish and it's piać in Sanskrit. Or the word for fire is ogień, it's like ogni, in the thing. And it's like, oh, so, and there's a strange sense of comfort when you find those links. And there's like a sense of satisfaction as well. Like in terms of some of the bigger sort of goddesses and figures, like I see like a huge similarity between like Kali and the dual nature of Parvati and Kali, and Morana or Majanna, depending on your dialect, in the Slavic countries. So the goddess of birth and rebirth, the kind of the dual nature, the motherhood, and then the blood and gore and the like female rage, and it's all like connected together in this powerful duality. And those goddesses have so much in common, and it's so lovely to see there's this like continuity. And you could say sometimes it's coincidental, maybe it's a bit of a stretch, especially with Slavic culture not having an sort of written record of its early mythology done contemporaneously in the same way that Norse mythology had it, or Greek and Roman mythologies. We don't have contemporaneous record. So a lot of it is kind of the work of linguists and anthropologists, kind of uncovering the links between similar stories and sort of trying to dig to the origins. But you can see a lot of similarities, like the Mesopotamian goddesses, like and some of it is, I think, comes from the fact that like humans have been asking themselves same kind of questions for a lot of human history, and eventually they would come to similar answers, I think, in one way or another.
Yeah, which brings me on to the bone roots, because it's not a spoiler, because it's part of the kind of the setup of the book. Is someone makes a deal with an entity at a crossroads, and that goes across lots of different kind of countries and mythologies, whether it's a crossroads demon or it's burying something at a crossroads, which is very common, or ley lines, and the cross means there's some kind of a branch, and therefore there's power in it, and all these sort of things tie together. And I thought, and then we've got the stuff in your book too, and I thought that sounds really familiar without having even started to read anything about the book. That struck a chord with me.
Yeah, thanks. I think there's like a like Crossroads, I think it has like this sense of sort of possibilities to it, like it can go well or it can go badly. You can pick the right road or you can pick the road, and both in like literal and more abstract sense. So in the bone roots, I think the characters come across many crossroads. In it's the whole sort of question I was asking myself and asking of the characters was like how far you will go to protect your child or to save your child, and how far are you willing to bend your ethics and morality in order to save your child. And like we like to think that there's certain universal truths, and I think it's just personally, I think it's a comforting myth that we tell ourselves, like I don't think there's anything. I mean, there's a lot of things that humans like to tell themselves, and I think it's a nice notion that we have like some universal values, universal across all mankind. And I think it's a nice notion, but I think it's a child's notion, because the moment you start to look at human history, you realize there's just nothing that's universal. There's no one thing that is universally considered bad across every part of the world. Like, because when you start thinking about like, okay, so murder, we think that murder is wrong, right?
Mm.
But what if you're murdering someone who means harm to those you love?
Mm-hmm.
What if you're murdering out of revenge for someone doing unspeakable acts?
Mm.
It and suddenly it becomes a different proposition.
Well,
And
that wades you into the deep waters of religion versus the law versus, what was considered perfectly normal a couple of 100 years ago now is completely banned and outlawed and things. But there are some universal truths, I think, about humanity. We don't always hold to them. I think we try to, and I think that's part of where children struggle sometimes when they become adults. They realize that the world isn't fair, that the rules that have been set up, they've been taught all their life, are society operates on everyone's willingness to go along with things. Nothing binds a person other than their willingness to do it. If they're caught not doing the thing they're not supposed to be doing, that's different. But there's no kind of internal thing. It's just up to the individual to decide. But then religion plays a massive role in that because it binds people with things that they think are stronger according to their beliefs, and the idea of sin. And so it's a really, anyway, but that's kind of wading way up into the deep end. But let's
yeah.
let's stick with the bone roots. We're talking about mothers and what they
but that's the plot. That's the plot.
Well, give the setup for those. We're kind of talking around it. So tell people the setup of the book, and then we'll get a bit more into that.
So there's two mothers in it. Vedma Kada. Kada is she's a Vedma, so she's like a hedge witch basically.
Right.
And on the other side you have this noble woman Sladiana. And 15 years before the book starts, they both plucked their babies from baby bearing tree of goddess Zemya. And one child was kidnapped by the elusive fox thief, that is sort of part legend, part this ever-present threat in people's mind, the child stealing fox. And Sladiana has been looking for her child for 15 years. And then you have Kada, whose child grows up with her, but she has started behaving more and more strangely. And you very quickly get a sense that Kada knows something that she's not letting on. And it's basically she is trying throughout the book to protect her child, to kind of bring her to a place of safety.
Yeah.
And it's about how sort of far you're willing to sort of to go to achieve that goal. And a lot of the book, but both female protagonists are women in their late 40s, and that was also important to me, to have a book about older female characters who are sort of who have full agency over lives, who are quite powerful, who fully own their sexuality. And it was so that is like a big part of me as well, about those women fitting into that society in those different ways.
Do you think you could have written this book 20 years ago?
No, I don't think so. I mean,
that was I was thinking, if I was trying to write something, I couldn't have done this in my 20s. I don't think I have the capacity.
Also 20 years ago I was 18. I could barely write my resume,
Some authors debut very young, remember, very young.
But I think I have definitely matured. And when we're talking about people sort of growing up seeing things like kind of black and white terms, I definitely think I saw things in a lot more sort of black and white than I do now. And I think I I think I had more of a kind of youthful sort of sense of like moral judgment, you know, of people's choices and like how people behave. And I think I was less understanding of when people did things that I did not consider like honorable or didn't consider to be like, I was quite it wasn't like a religious sort of sense of morality. It was more of a kind of like, you know, if someone's not truthful, like a person who's not truthful is like dead
Mm.
to me, you know, like, and I think, you know, as I get older, I understand people more, I think, and and I'm softer towards people than I was. And I think this book really required me to be kind of more understanding towards people, because you have two protagonists and they're antagonists by circumstance. And you know, like again, this is not a spoiler because it's literally in a blurb,
Yeah.
but only one of them will succeed in keeping her child safe. So at the end of the book, you know one of them is not getting what she wants.
Mm.
And it's when when you have two characters that both have, they both have good and bad sides to them, and hopefully you kind of root for both of them to, like, because it's a just want, to protect your child. That's a very
Yeah.
reasonable ask. So I when I was younger, I don't think I would have had the kind of depth of understanding
Mm.
that would have allowed me to think in those terms.
Yeah. Yeah. So was it important to show the good and bad in both characters? Because what, as you said, one isn't the hero and one isn't the villain. They're two women in their 40s who both, have a desire to protect or find their child, which is both very worthwhile. So they're both, well, I don't want to say grey, but perhaps they're both grey because they're both human. So is that important so that you don't get people going, oh, I'm just rooting for this character or I'm just rooting for that character?
Absolutely. I mean, I don't think there are, characters that are all good or all bad don't interest me at all. Like,
Yeah.
because they're not, you cease to be human when you're all good or all bad, like it doesn't, people certainly try to project a sense of righteousness, but I don't think, that is ever something that is achievable. And yeah, and I think, like, so even, for those of us who, like, who don't have children, like, most of us have someone that we're willing to do pretty bad things for, like, it's like, or something in their lives that they're willing to compromise their moral compass otherwise
Yeah.
for, right?
Yeah.
So in that way, I don't, it's not just a book for people who, have experienced, motherhood. It's a book for people who can see that, like, when pushed far enough, everyone is capable of anything.
Yeah, it's like that experiment they did with the in America with the scientists. Remember, with the electrocuting people? Do you hear about
Oh,
that with the
yes.
box? And they're saying if you keep turning it
Yeah.
up, and they'd hear the screams, and because someone was telling them to do it, they kept doing it. They said if
And
you get
that
to 10,
wasn't even like decent motivation. That was just peer
no,
pressure.
that was like being given an order and being told to do it, and people just did it. And even though they know that if it went to 10, it was terminal, and that quite a few people just did it because they wouldn't rebel against a figure in authority. So it shows you that under a mild pressure, some people will just go with the crowd, will just fold against an authority figure. Whereas if it's something that you actually care about and want to protect, it can really test your moral limits for sure.
Yeah. I think in terms of, there's the, like, in this book, I think it's definitely like the kind of a very individual life of those people, because both those women
Mm.
keep their inner life to themselves in many ways. So they kind of, so it's about their own individual struggle, individual choices. Um, like, so in my first book, The Second Bell, it was a lot about this kind of, well, you could say, peer pressure from the community.
Hmm.
So, we might all say that, you know, we would all like, you know, oh, I would protect my child. Like, even if a community cast me out, like I would protect my child. But then when you grow up in a community that tells you one thing, and we see it in like very religious communities where you have families that, you know, cast out or hurt their own children on kind of, well, you could say moral grounds. It's not my kind of morality, but it's
No,
the
according to
morality
the
of their
structure of
community.
their belief in the community, yes. Certain
Yes,
things are accepted and
exactly.
certain things are not. And so going against that kind of a thing, like some, it's not even that bad, but some people I know say they can't marry outside their own caste within certain religions, which even today, you know, it's still very common, and which I find so unusual. But for them, it's just part of their community and part of their world, and it doesn't seem like a huge sacrifice to them. Where for someone like me, I think that would be such a huge restriction. But there again, would I be willing to give up my entire family and support group and community in order to go against something like that? So it's
Yeah.
it's a big
I think
question.
it's very often not just presented like this, if you see what I mean. Like, it's basically, it's not
It's not an
merely
ultimatum.
you have to marry.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's more of a kind of, well, don't you want to marry someone who is brought up like you, who have same values, who is, you know, has the same sort of structure in life, who has the same sort of religious observances, you know, and those similarities, like, it's hard to agree, but those similarities do make life easier in many ways, right? Of
Yeah.
course, when you then take that simple fact that similarities in married life make married life easier, and take it to an extreme and amp it out to the exclusion of others, then that forms a problem. But it so depends on people, like, yeah.
So tell me about the actual tree itself, the actual bone tree, and you know, is that a pure invention of yours, or has this come from Slavic mythology?
Yes. Yes, it is an invention of mine.
Okay.
So ziemia in Polish means the earth. And I kind of like, I anglicized the names, obviously, because they're largely unpronounceable in English. I mean, yeah, try saying świtosz, you know, it's like,
No. No.
or much less try to decipher the Polish spelling of it. So, you know, you have to kind of make those things. So I thought Zemia sounds nice, and it sounds kind of more softer, more kind of like Eastern Slavic languages, which English people sort of tend to prefer the sound of. But so the goddess of the earth, and I kind of thought about this omnipresent being with kind of, you know, like the way people think, because, you know, the way people think about sort of omnipresent, omniscient gods,
Yeah.
right? And, you know, a lot of people find it very comforting, that concept. I never did. I mean, I grew up in a very Catholic country, and I always found that like I did not want anybody with access to my innermost life. Like, I felt like that is like, there's parts of me that are private, like for me, and like I did not want to let anyone, like, I just found the idea of somebody being present all the time and having access to all information about me, I just found it really distressing. And like, I kind of ran with that feeling, you know. So there's this goddess who is like, you know, people find her presence comforting, right?
Yes.
And she has there's the tree of goddess Zemia, and her tree's roots are like made of bone, and they go across, like crisscross the entire land, and they go and they're everywhere, all across Fiesna, just under the surface. And she is a sentient being that some people can kind of communicate with, like the Vedmas, you know, those hedge witches, they have like this affinity to the roots. Like they can they understand what the roots expect of them in one way, right? Or another. But in terms of what the goddess wants, like you don't, unless like she can express it sometimes, right? Or you can feel that she is uneasy or that she is not satisfied with something, you know. But then when the axe swings down, it's, you know, that's when you find out that she's really unhappy. And like, but she is constantly there. And that for me was this, I hope it came across in the book. I wanted to create, because it has like this book has an element of mystery to it, and it has an element of this kind of thrillery sort of sense of dread that is kind of building throughout the book. And part of that is the sense that there is this creature that is always there.
Yes.
That spies on you. Basically, that spies on you, and she has a will and intentions and goals of her own, and they might just not coincide with yours. And it does create that sense of unease, especially in the main character she is a Vedma, so she does have affinity of roots. She got the present of her daughter from the tree, right? So
she's got
she
an
knows
obligation.
more than the reader does.
She's got an obligation as well, perhaps, too.
An obligation and like a sense of a deal that is not completely done.
Yeah.
Perhaps,
yeah.
You know, and in Slavic folklore, the thing that is very important is people kind of adhering to the deals they made.
Right.
And people being truthful in their dealings. And you know, when you make a deal with a creature, when you make a bargain of any kind, you have to hold up your end. Trickery is not rewarded in Slavic folklore. So unlike the Norse mythology, where the trickster can get out of trouble.
Yeah, you can con the trickster.
Yes, exactly. So cons are not rewarded. You basically, if the spirit get a sense that you're trying to weasel your way out of a deal, like you get a mountain brought down upon you. So you know, in some cases, in other cases, mice eat you. So you know, you want and well.
So how does everybody else who aren't one of these head witches, how do they view, you know, this god and their influence, its influence on them? Are they kind of just wary? Are they don't believe? Are there any that don't believe? Is I suppose another question, that just aren't interested in that?
There's none that don't believe in the book, because it's when you have like goddesses' roots wriggling out of the ground every now and again and doing weird things.
Requires less belief, more evidence.
Yes. So empirically speaking,
yes,
like,
that's
you know,
more convincing.
Yes. So, but they have a link to the goddess through the Vedmas, right?
Yeah.
So there are people who can communicate with a tree, and that offers a sense of comfort. There are rituals, there are holidays, there are, you know, gift giving sort of rituals that they observe, and that, you know, provides a level of comfort, you know, much the way that like all human beings that observe some kind of religious rites get a sense of comfort. Like, you know, I've done my bit. I have offered prayer. I have offered the sacrifice. I have done the things expected of me. And so hopefully that'll be enough.
It's just so interesting to me that even today there are so many holidays, customs, rituals, habits, and things that people do, and they don't even know why they do some of them. It's just become part of habit, and we still don't, like, there's no clear answer of why we do some of the things we do, and we still do it now. But there again, we celebrate, like, with the harvest festival, And that's an old pagan thing, but all the kids do it in school now. And like,
I mean,
Christmas tree. That come on. Jesus didn't start the
very
Christmas
German.
tree. Anybody thinks Jesus started the Christmas tree tradition, go back and check it out. Easter, that wasn't. So there's all these things like, why do
I
people
think
knock on
both are
wood?
very, I think it's really, I think, obviously once you start digging, all of those stories have a very, very good, very interesting explanation.
Mhm.
And, like storytelling is just an intrinsic part of human nature. That
All
is
the way
one
back,
thing
yeah.
we do consistently throughout all cultures, all around the world.
Yeah.
So, so I think, when you get those stories, and some of those are, more recent than others,
Mm.
it's, yeah, like, when it comes to harvest, it's like, I think a lot of it is just gratitude,
Mhm.
like you have whatever gods you sort of worship have seen fit to bless you with this, with this
Bountiful
good
harvest.
harvest. Exactly, especially, in communities where that was perhaps less certain, and like in many places where a bad harvest meant death,
Yep.
so
Starvation,
so
struggle,
so
famine.
exactly. So, a sense of gratitude is very much to be expected. And, even, and that is not even like ancient history. I'm reading, I have finished it. I kind of took a break from it because it's quite heavy reading. I actually have it here. So this book, it's a bestseller in Poland. It's called Chłopki. It means female peasants in
Right.
Polish.
Okay.
And basically what it is, it's a nonfiction about how uh, women lived in the Polish countryside
Yep.
until essentially the start of communism in Poland, until the sort of the invasion of Poland, like post World War II. And obviously the totalitarian state was terrible, right?
Mhm.
But in many ways, you see how much this, like, suddenly universal education, the universal, certain universal rights have changed the way that women were in Poland. Because my grandmother's generation,
Mhm.
my great grandmother's generation,
Yep.
were women who were treated like chattel in Poland. Like Poland was really far behind a lot of sort of Western Europe in a way, like in a way they treated the women.
Right.
And it's, but this like sheer poverty that you read about, like the way, like just how backwards the agriculture was, so that even in the 30s, bad harvest meant women were and children were starving,
Mhm.
like my dad was telling me, like I remember my dad was telling me of the soup that his great grandmother used to make, the stinging nettle soup.
Right.
And the thing is, it's just like, the way he experienced it was probably very nice. But in this book, I was reading about how stinging nettle was the spring food when all the other food was gone.
Yep.
And it was just boiled water with stinging nettle, and that is my great grandmother's generation. My great grandmother only had 3 years of education.
Right.
One of them. And she still considered herself lucky, you know?
Mm.
And uh, so when we look back on that kind of those harvest, celebrations, I think from a modern overly luxurious lifestyles that we're experiencing, in this country, compared to like history wise, like I'm not,
Yeah.
obviously cost of living crisis, and people are struggling to heat their homes, they're struggling to feed their children in this country. I'm not denying
Yeah.
any of
Yeah.
that, but I'm talking about like real famine.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we had
That
plagues before COVID. There was no widespread plagues that would hit the world and it would decimate the population. The Black Death and all these kind of things. Like even there again, Ring a Ring of Roses, kids sing. That's to do with the Black Death and the tissues, and that's what that's all about. But we still got it as a folklore song that's carried through to the present day. So yeah, it but yes,
So,
today we struggle, but compared to historically, it was a lot worse.
yeah, and it's
Lifespan was shorter.
very recent history. So I think a lot of those traditions that are observed still that seem strangely kind of quaint and outdated, I think they stem from the fact that it wasn't very long ago that life was really, really hard, you know, like my grandfather, like basically every meal I had in my grandparents' house, like my grandfather would remind me as a child, like as a child, I suffered hunger. So no food goes to waste in my house, you know,
My
every meal.
my great aunt would say, "Clean your plate. Make sure you clean the plate." You know, there's people that don't get this, and so
Yeah.
I make sure I clean
But
my plate.
yeah. I mean, perhaps she didn't make it so personal as
No,
I had to steal moldy bread from Nazi horses, but you know.
not quite that bad, but yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So given that you've created this society in the bone roots and it's all different to the present day, it isn't the present day. Was it a challenge for you as a writer to not try and include some of those modern sensibilities and the things that we've been talking about? Like, how hard was it? It's not a period piece per se, but it's not 21st century with someone making a deal for their child.
I think there definitely, it depends on like, it's softened. It's certainly softened because especially like, you know, reading this book and there's like first person accounts of like how women lived and stuff like that. If you wrote it exactly how it was,
Yeah.
then that's what the book would be about.
Yes.
Because people know so little now about how their great grandparents lived. It's shocking how little people know about any context that isn't their own. And I'm like, you know, in terms of the general population, like, you know, people struggle to understand mentality from 30 years ago.
Try to explain
So
to kids what life was like before the internet. That's the funniest thing I've seen. I've tried that. People are like, "What did you do all day?" Wait, what do you mean? We read books. But like, yeah, but what else did you do? Just go online? No, there's no going online. So just even that
yes.
generation gap. So if you try and go back even further to Victorian times, they just can't get their head around it. So even
No, I mean,
further
it's
back
like
is
exactly. And it's just, and not even Victorian times, like, you know, thing like world that looked more similar to a modern day, like where we had cars and stuff like that.
yeah,
And
yeah.
yet the mentality was very different. People struggle to compute it, and they kind of, and I think it's like we're coming up on Christmas, the yearly sort of debate, one could call it, about the song "Baby It's Cold Outside."
Right.
Like, I just smack my head against desk every time I hear people talk about it. And there's like people rewriting the song to introduce consent. And you just sort of think like, do you really not understand the context? Like that there is a context to how women were expected to behave, and that the female singer in a song wants to stay, but she has to go through those steps of basically demurring and saying like, you know, oh, I can't stay, but maybe just a one cigarette, you know, like, because a woman couldn't express you know, sexual desire without being instantly marked for it. And so that was an expected element of courtship. And people just can't understand it, that it's not about him roofing her drink. It's about her saying like, oh, the drink is so strong, I'm going to throw caution to the wind. Yeah? Like it's
Yeah.
and like every single year I hear people talking about like, oh, we should do away with this horrible rape song. I'm just like, and so when you have that level of misunderstanding, very recent context, when you're writing historical books, as you know, it's very hard to present certain things truthfully without making the book all about it. So
Yes.
if I wrote a book with, you know, women in the countryside, similar to like Polish countryside of like 17th century or whatever, and the way they lived and the way they were treated truthfully, then it would become the gruesome account of horrendous mistreatment of women, like, rather than the plot that I actually had in mind and
The
the
mystery and the
concepts that I
thriller.
did have in mind.
Yeah.
So while I tried to remain truthful in some elements, I moved it. And I mean, there is like a sapphic motif in the book as well, which is probably not something that would have been widely understood and accepted, realistically. But it's just something I wanted to include. And I'm interested in people and how they see the world and how they kind of change. And, fantasy gives you the opportunity to explore that in a more free way.
Yeah, fantasy is the ultimate cheat code, I think, to tell any kind of a story however you really want, and use it to talk about people today, society, issues like we've talked about. And it allows me to do that and go anywhere and do anything, whether it's folklore, whether it's history, whether it's a blending of fantasy and whatever you invent. I think that's why I like fantasy so much. It's just so freeing, I think, compared to some genres. There are some tropes and there are some things that are expected, but because there are so many subgenres, you can kind of do almost what you want within the genre in some ways. So
yeah, I mean, it's difficult when you like switch from that complete freedom of creating a world that might be related to our world but is also separate, to writing something contemporary. That's a challenge. That's a real switch. It's interesting as well in its own way.
It's a lot easier in some ways. You have to explain far less.
Yes.
You're not setting up things.
Although it depends who's reading it, right? Because my context is not the context of someone else, I remember I was reading, unfortunately, I remember no names. So we've established before, I'm really bad with names. No real context here. I'm going to just give you the anecdote with zero context.
Okay, cool.
So basically, this journalist was interviewing a member of English aristocracy,
right?
And it was on unrelated subject, but she thought she caught him in a lie, because she said, "You told me that you had not organized any parties in this period.
Yeah.
And yet now you're telling me that this person attended a party at your house." And so she thought, "You're lying to me," right? In her context, it was a lie. In Hink's context, which he promptly explained, it was not a party. It was a straightforward shooting evening with only a dozen or so people, just a shooting trip and dinner. It was not a party. Because in his context, a party is 150 people in ball gowns, doing whatever it is they do. So, context matters. And I think it's, in that sense, that's why it's so important to me to have books driven from the characters rather than necessarily, from things happening, because we all have like some level of understanding of like, basic human instincts, whereas like the context can always bring an element of confusion or, something. I remember reading this book ages ago. It was really good. I don't remember the title. It was by Amanda Creek.
Right.
And it was about, it's a contemporary novel. And it was focused on this marriage of upper middle class people who were asset rich, but because they owned a house, like a sizable house in London that they're trying to sell in order to have a divorce, but they couldn't sell it for some reason. So all they could do was relocate temporarily to Cornwall.
Okay.
Right. And there are elements there where, like, I thought it was quite skillfully done, like this play with the main characters, like you see it from their point of view. They're like, this is a real problem that I have. I can only rent out this cottage, but if it's historical cottage in Cornwall, like, isn't that shit? Like, and I can't get divorced. I'm stuck, and it is a real problem from my point of view. But then you have the context of other people living in Cornwall, which is slightly more yes, whose situation is slightly different. And I thought that was really interesting from the point of view of if you have, say, if you're only familiar with, say, upper middle class people and or upper class people, like, I don't know, Rishi Sunak, right, or someone like, people who have never spoken to what you call, like, a working person unless it was their chauffeur, right?
Yeah, working class
and
person, yeah.
and they cannot understand their context. They might try if they're particularly, like, empathetic or whatever, but it's really, really hard. And so when they're reading a novel about the struggles of an upper middle class person who only has one house, this family only has one house,
Wow.
and they can't buy another one, and it's just, they really feel for them. Whereas, like, if you have a working class person who's struggling to pay their electric bill, and they're reading that, like, oh, so you're sitting on, like, £1 million asset. Like, I fail to see the issue, so if your whole book is only focused on external difficulties, it can sometimes create a real range of reactions, and some intended, some unintended. So yeah.
So with that in mind, have you had feedback from people that aren't mothers, that don't have children, that have read the Bone Roots, that get it completely, because it's about the fact that it's what they'd be willing to do to protect somebody they love, and we all have somebody close to us.
Yeah, that was but I actually did have a few people tell me that. So they said, like, that they had no children, and they were not a woman, but they could understand it. They could because they could understand, like, because they have people in their lives that they would do horrible things for, even if they don't necessarily like to dwell on it outside of the immediate. Because none of us like to dwell on it, like how bad would you go? Like, none of us like to think about it, like how, like, just exactly how cruel. Like, I think if you actually go into that mindset, you're either a writer or some kind of sociopath, because
those are the two things. It really is one or the other.
If you really dwell on that, like, just how nasty would I get, so it's but I think there is a sense within most of us that there are lines we would cross.
Definitely. Great. Well, so I guess, are you going to do any more stories in this world, or is it self-contained and that's it for now, and see how it goes?
It's self-contained. Although I have actually written a short story about one of the side characters, which people can only get because it's an exclusive if they sign up for my newsletter. I'm being very mean, but I'm not giving it out otherwise.
But then they get all the news on your upcoming books and stuff. So, and they get a bonus story. So there you go. Even more reason to do it. Okay. Well, The Bone Roots is out now from Angry Robot Books. And of course, to get people to check out your other books as well, The Wind Child and The Second Bell. And what else have I forgotten?
The Storm Child is the second part of The Wind Child. So
there you go. Yeah. There you go. Well, thank you for joining me tonight. And I'll put links down below for people to find your information and your newsletter and stuff. And we'll see you all later. Good night, everyone.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Good night.